I can go ahead and kick us off. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen with the Middleton Chamber. We are pleased to have you guys joining us for a conversation today about compensation. So Jeff is one of those guys that you meet and you instantly are gravitate towards. So he's got a really extensive background. I'm going to let him tell you mostly about it, but has worked in large corporations such as Marriott and Walt Disney World. So he just has some really great perspective on compensation, especially as we struggle through the workforce and just not enough people. So with that, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you and just be here to listen. We also will be using the poll function today as well as chat. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to drop them in there and we will have Jeff get started.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate it. So very briefly, a little bit about me. I have had a career that has been primarily in HR. I started out at the Walt Disney Company directly out of grad school and subsequently worked for mostly what I would call corporate America, companies like Marriott and Charles Schwab. Along the way, though, I've also kind of gone into smaller size businesses, startups, and small privately owned businesses. And so I've kind of gone through a variety of different roles. Right now, I'm the owner, CEO, and president of a healthcare company called Activa Therapy. We provide clinicians in Illinois, Kansas, and Missouri to people who are receiving care at home. But I talk about compensation. I think about compensation a lot because I spent a lot of my career directly involved in it. So what I hope to do today is just share one person's experiences, my experiences, talk a little bit about compensation and how it works, and some of the things that are challenges and some of the, I guess I would say, tips or secrets for success. If we hadn't gotten a little bit of a late start, I would have asked everybody to kind of tell us a little bit about yourselves, but for the sake of expediency and our time, I'm going to just kind of go through this. But if you wouldn't mind, if you have questions or things that you specifically want to chat about, please don't hesitate to chat, and Kristen will be monitoring those. And Kristen, if you have something that seems like a burning issue, don't hesitate to bring it up. And if not, then we can wait and just have hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. I want to start out with kind of a big picture view of compensation and how I see that as fitting into overall business structures. And then further on, we'll try and drill down into some specific areas and topics, and we'll use a couple polls to try and assess where the areas of most interest to you and where I can drill down a little bit deeper. So in terms of compensation, one thing, do you guys all have the menu here in the middle of your screen? Can you tell me? I have it in the middle of mine, but I'm not sure if you...
We can see the slide.
Okay, great. In terms of compensation, one thing that sometimes businesses get confused about is they think that, well, if we just pay people more or pay them differently or whatever, that will solve our problems. And in general, one of the things that I've learned through experience is that compensation can help support your business objectives, but it can't be the primary driver of them. The driver of your business is going to be the leadership and the job they do in terms of connecting the dots for people, for them to understand their roles, understanding how they can contribute towards that performance, and being inspired to do as well as they can. And in fact, compensation can reinforce those things, or in fact, it can be in conflict and can make them not as effective. But the reality is that your pay programs are just one piece of a tool to really reinforce the broader vision and mission and strategies of the company. And in general, in my experience, which has included working, I used to own a light industrial staffing company. We had anywhere from 300 to 500 people working in a given shift. And I was paying literally minimum wage or $1 or $2 more for most of those people. And at the same time, I was the CHRO of the largest algorithmic trading firm in the world at the time, which was called Getco, where we were literally paying kids right out of school millions of dollars. And interestingly enough, some of the same issues exist in those two very diverse environments. One of the things is that the overall effectiveness of the compensation program, at least in my belief, is really a product of some very simple things. Do people think they're being treated fair and reasonably? Is the treatment, in their opinion, appropriate? Is it consistent? How does it fit in given the business environment? A quick story about kind of relative treatment. I was the director of executive compensation at Marriott in the early 90s when Marriott spun off what is now Host Marriott. It was a big deal. And Marriott had bought and built a bunch of hotels and was also operating them. And this goes back to the 90s, probably before some of you were born. But basically, there was something called the savings and loan crisis. And what happens is that anybody who owned a lot of real estate was really heavily penalized in the stock market because they had debt and loans, and that was a bad thing. So the chief financial officer at the time was a guy by name Steve Bolenbach, and I'll talk about him because he's passed. He was a good guy, but it's an interesting thing. But anyways, he engineered this deal that caused Mr. Marriott's personal wealth to grow by about $1.5 billion. It was a big deal. And so Mr. Marriott asked the CHRO to talk to me. And my mission was to go to Steve Bolenbach and talk to him about his compensation package for doing this incredible spinoff that made the company, phenomenally more valuable in terms of stock market valuation. And it was kind of the thing where you split off the bad part, and then there was a good part. The bad part was Host Marriott that had a lot of debt. The good part was Marriott International that was just getting revenue streams, royalty fees, no debt. And so sure enough, that two of those together were more valuable in the marketplace than it had been before. So I go up to see Steve Bolenbach and talk to Steve, and Mr. Marriott proposed a package. And it was about $80 million in stock, a bunch of cash on top of that, call it $125 million. And, Steve listened thoughtfully and attentively. And then he said, I'm really disappointed. That just seems like relative to the value I've created for the shareholders, the value for Mr. Marriott, that doesn't seem appropriate. I think it should be a lot more. So I'm shaking my head kind of to myself thinking, oh my God, how can this be? And it really came down at the end of the day, talking to him a little bit further. It was about, Al Chafke over at Northwest Airlines, which by the way was one of his college buddies or whatever, has got paid this much for the deal that he did. And his whole perspective was relative to the shareholder value created, was I being treated fairly? $125 million didn't do it. And so, I think human beings look for this consistency, this context, this notion that they're being treated that way. I also had a employee when I owned First Choice Staffing, this light industrial staffing company. And one day, I get choked up every time I think about this. Shortly before Christmas, he came in and he had a foil package and he said, "This is to recognize and thank you." And I was like, "Well, for what?" And he said, "Everything you've done for me." And I'm thinking to myself, this guy has an almost minimum wage job, and how could he possibly be thanking me? And he said, "Relative to where I came from and the challenges that I have, you've given me an opportunity to come here and work. My wife works for you. My 2 teenage daughters work for you. We appreciate how you care for us. We appreciate how you treat us. I want to just thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you've done for us." And here I am, and I'm thinking, this guy is making, a few dollars an hour. How can this possibly be that he was so thankful? And it just is, the human perspective is about how am I being treated? So the discussion today is, how do you reinforce the things that make people feel like, oh, this is fair and reasonable? So a couple things that in a broad sense work and things that don't work. One thing that works, I think, really well is having a compensation philosophy in your company, understanding what compensation is about. It seems like that would be obvious, but often compensation is relegated to the CFO or a person who's in a financial role. They're thinking of it in the context of income statements. and balance sheets. And it's not really about what do we believe in, but when you understand what your company is about, when you understand what's the mission, what do we believe in, what are our values, those are things that then allow you to articulate policies, including compensation policies, that help support that. So, some of the things that really work well, I think, are having an articulated policy. Simplicity. Oh my God, in compensation, people sometimes make very elaborate and clever things, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But basically, if people can understand it, it has meaning, and if they can't, it doesn't. Another thing that I think is really important is authenticity. People know when you're BSing, and I just believe that when management says, oh, we can't afford it, and then you see new Jags in the parking lot or whatever, it just doesn't ring true. And so as a leader, as a person who is administering compensation, I think it's really important to be authentic with people, be candid. And sometimes that means when there's bad news. And I'll tell you a little bit, my healthcare company that I originally got involved in as a passive investment, but ended up as the operating manager because it's been struggling. We have some very significant challenges, financial challenges. And I try to be really clear with people where we are. I would love to pay them more than I can, but I can't afford it. And here's our numbers. This is what we're doing. This is our average revenue. This is, what we're paying. And, it's amazing how much people will give you in terms of flexibility if they know that you're being sincere and real. In terms of policy, another thing I like in general sense is broad policies that create framework, but that aren't so tight that you're constrained in terms of doing what's right. And sometimes I see really detailed compensation plans and processes that make, a lot of sense on paper, so to speak, but in the practical world, they don't work. And so what do? You violate your policy. Sorry about that. I should have turned that off. So in any case, I think it's really important that, you are authentic and clear and real, that you have policies that are flexible, but not too tight. Things that don't work, I don't really need to go into these in detail. I think you guys get it, confusion, complexity, opaqueness, rigidity, unjustified arbitrariness. And regrettably, that happens all the time. I've been a perpetrator of a lot of those things. But the reality is they hurt rather than help. So this is kind of the traditional compensation framework and how it works. First of all, you have a set of external factors. There are things you don't control. Then there are internal factors, which you as an individual might control, but are kind of the purview of your company, your leadership's perspectives, the economics of your business, people's expectations, the availability of workforce, all of those types of factors. And then based on those, you define a compensation philosophy that talks about things in terms of, well, this is what we want to do. We want to recognize our limited resources and use them as efficiently as possible. We want to create an environment where we substitute quality of work life for pay. We want to create an environment where we pay in the top quartile for our industry to attract the best and brightest people. Those are the types of things that you articulate as a compensation philosophy. And then those things in turn then inform your specific compensation plans and programs. This is how we evaluate jobs. This is our salary structure. This is our merit budget. All of those pieces then reinforce that compensation philosophy that hopefully you've defined or articulated. So how do you go about doing that? It could be simple as just saying to your senior leaders, or maybe you are a senior leader, to think about what is the purpose of our pay and what do I want to get the most? How do I get the most bang for my buck with what we're spending on people? And if you're part of a bigger organization, sometimes you can, utilize it as an opportunity to learn about the things that as a general manager or as a manager in your organization are really important. Like, what's important to this company? What do we care about? What are the perspectives of the people who are leading the company? What are their hot buttons? What are the things that, they don't care about really? And discussion to define what I would say is your compensation philosophy. Writing it down can be very useful, because then when situations come up, you have a point of reference to say, okay, well, given what we know about this situation, how does this fit with our comp philosophy? What should we do? And having clarity in terms of your business objectives is really important. Having a planning process where you sit on an annual basis or biannual, quarterly, every 5 years, whatever it is, talk about where we're going, what we're doing. Those are all things that really help inform how are we going to structure our paid programs and what are we going to do. And then kind of a final piece to really create this compensation philosophy is to figure out, well, what happens if things go south? What happens if for whatever reason, we have a 20% contraction in business? And I've faced those situations and been in a compensation role where we had to figure it out. So one of the things that I think is really interesting to do, and it depends obviously on your individual roles in terms of what you do, is to really just sit down. And this is an example of a forced ranking type system. There are other things that you can do, but it's basically to say what's most important to you of this group of statements. And ideally, these should kind of be specific to your organization, not just generalities, because everybody will say they care the most about their people. No, you want to know cost, recruiting people, turnover, dig into those little nuances that help you understand in a more nuanced way about what's important in your company and how you need to manage pay to fit the circumstance and the, I'll say the mission or the vision and the values of your company. So let me do before I go there, can we do the first poll, Kristen? So I'm just kind of curious as to where we are on having a compensation philosophy. So
the poll should have popped up on your screen. The question is, how would you describe the compensation philosophy at your company? Let's give everybody a couple seconds here. Right.
So
answers rolling in.
Yes. So that's kind of what I would expect. And, a lot of things are aspirational in our life, right? But I would encourage you, and in some ways it can be a catalyst for a very interesting and meaningful discussion about what's going on. But in a lot of companies, labor is a huge component of the spend. If you have an IP-based business, in architecture, engineering, consulting, some of my background is in those areas, trading, totally IP and technology based. I mean, those are the places where, comp dollars are a big big chunk of the business. And sometimes leadership hasn't had the time, hasn't had the focus, or just hasn't had the question asked, what do we want to really get out of our pay? How important is it to us? How much variability are we comfortable with in it? Those are really interesting and important things that you can ask about. So I'm gonna stop sharing. Do you wanna? Here, I don't know if you guys see it. So here's the poll results. So nobody came in on robust, clear, and useful. And it seems like most people have some mixture of policies, and one person is like, yeah, we make it work. And or is, I guess, I prefer to be polite. So that's kind of what I would expect. All right. So let's talk a little bit more now about some routine challenges that you might be facing. And this is an area where, again, we're going to do another survey, but basically, these are all things that I think you're likely to be, dealing with. Tight labor markets, trying to figure out how you get the talent that you need with the limited resource that is dollars that you have. Compensation, administration, structures, merit budgets, salary structures, things like that. Policy and exceptions. I think this is always an interesting topic. Like, how do you balance those things and what do you do? incentive systems, base versus incentive comp, different levels of incentive comp, and then finally, non-pecuniary compensation, other things that have real value that can be a substitute sometime for salary dollars, because people are willing to make less money because they love working there. And I think those are very important and of increasing importance and have impacted me personally in my life significantly. So let's dive into these topics. So tight labor markets, a couple of things that you need to do is, it's one thing to post an Indeed job and just be like, oh man, that sucks, we didn't get anybody. But it's another thing to really understand and keep good metrics to understand what's going on. Why is it that you're not getting people? How many people did you actually interview? If you had interviews, what was your response rate in terms of acceptances? If people rejected, what did they tell you as to why they didn't do it? And one of the things that's happened, I think, in recruiting is that technology has automated so much of the process. Submit your resume, and it's added efficiency for sure, but unfortunately what it's done is reduce the link between the person who is making decisions about employment and the candidate. And it's kind of more harvesting now, as opposed to really learning and being there. So I think that's something to think about in terms of, gosh, is this an area where we lose even though we gain some in terms of efficiency? A second thing to understand is, like, what is the labor market really? And there's tons of good resources, SHRM, if you go to the Fed, actually, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis publishes a ton of economic data, jobs, apartment availability, all kinds of things. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to really understand some of the core metrics that are influencing where you have people. A third thing that I think is often neglected is really understanding the cost of turnover, and having people who come and stay. It can save you a lot of money. The cost of onboarding people, of training them, getting them set up in benefits, teaching them, the subtleties of their job, all that stuff has immense costs often. And if you don't really understand it, sometimes people will think, oh, well, we'll save money, we won't pay as much. And then you have more turnover, and it ends up at the end of the day that you're unsuccessful. So I think it's really important to understand the magnitude of the investments you're making in people. And then a final point that I think is relevant, and this came out of my experience in trading, where it's explicit, but in many industries, I think this is true. And I would say at Disney and at Marriott, it was true as well when I was there. But it's often kind of the top 20% of performers in your organization who create like 80% of the value. And those are people that you do not want to lose. And so as you shepherd your scarce resources, focus on those people and make sure that you're doing everything that you can. And God forbid you have a policy or something that prevents you from keeping a person that you desperately want to keep because they're at the max of the range or whatever. And I'll talk a little bit about exceptions. So what are some other things that you can do? And, employment is a big part of any general manager's responsibility, in my view. But there are things that I think you can do that are a little bit crazy. Sometimes you have to think differently if you're faced with a problem that is a persistent and unchanging problem. And that means experimenting with things. For example, I hired developers for my healthcare company. Developers are really expensive. As I said, we're under a lot of price pressure, what do I do or whatever. Well, I've done this in the past. One of the things is to look for people who can bring those same core skills, but aren't necessarily fully trained in that regard. So it turns out that if you want to hire programmers, my best developers that I have ever worked with have actually been people who came out of the arts. And why is that? Because if you're a music major, pattern recognition is critically important what to do, as well as technical precision. You have to play the right notes. You can't just make it up all the time. And so that's a combination of skills for people like music majors that makes it really generalizable to software that in fact, a lot of those people, especially if they're really smart, can end up being outstanding developers. So the guy that one of my favorite hires at the company I'm at now, Rory, he was a theater major. He majored in lighting, but he also had a perfect math SAT. And it turns out he is a hell of a good developer with a lot of both the right and left brain skills that you need to be successful in software development. And yet, he came to me really cheap because he was used to getting paid as a theater major, which is, you probably know what that means. So in any case, I'm just saying, think outside the box in terms of what the people you look like need to be. Another thing to think about, and especially if you're at a more senior level, is like, do we really need as many people as we have to do this? Or is there a way that we can enhance our automation, invest in capital infrastructure that reduces our reliance on the number of people we get, or hire fewer but more highly skilled people who can do more of these jobs? Outsourcing, I don't need to spend time talking about that. Recruiting, I can't tell you how often in bigger companies I've been at that people have been like, well, that's part of HR. That's not what we do. Yeah, I'll interview somebody, but that's not my responsibility. That's not true. Your responsibility as a leader in the company is to get the best possible talent that you have. And that means you should take it on. So if HR owns and runs recruiting, I think that's actually an issue of insufficient accountability for people who really will be utilizing that talent. There's lots of other things that you can do. I mean, it just goes on and on. You have hourly employees, your production shop, and you don't have what you need. Every year, buy a truck and have a raffle at the end of the year for everybody who has 99% attendance or whatever. Do things that are different, that are unique, that differentiate you from other employers, and that indicate you want to give more to your employees. Even if you can't afford to give more, you want to give more to your employees, and create a mentality of, oh, this employer actually cares about us. That's what you're trying to do. Compensation administration. So this is merit budgets and salary ranges and all of those fun things. I think, businesses have natural rhythms. They have periods of robust growth, and then they have times that are a little bit tighter. And each business has these cycles or expectations, even if you're Meta or Google, and you go from this to that, then all of a sudden, before you know it, you're doing massive layoffs or whatever. You have to understand business has cycles, it has its own rhythm. And so creating salary and compensation programs that are in tune with that rhythm is really important. That means that you write in your policy flexibility that allows you to address things in different types of business situations and different environments. Any environment that, yes, we always pay more and it's an annual merit budget and it's going to be this to that percent and this is how we do it, I think is often lacking the reality in the context that industries have cycles. And so it's important to be able to address those issues in the design of your compensation structure. I was working at Charles Schwab, in fact, initially in HR, VP of compensation and HR. I went into finance, and then I ended up ultimately getting an opportunity to go out and run branches. And I ended up being senior vice president of retail brokerage for about a fifth of the branches in the country, about 72 branches in 13 states that I was running. And first of all, it was a fabulous experience. I loved it. It was great. I relied on people around me who knew so much more than me. It was a wonderful experience. But then something that was called the dot-com bubble burst, and trading revenues declined by 90%. And Chuck came to the retail branch network and said, I need you to give me $230 million in expenses on an annual basis. And what do you do? And as a fraction of the operating budget, that was a big chunk of money, I can tell you. So what do you do? And so, one of the experiences that I had is that, and really sitting down and thinking about it as a senior management team, and this was, I think, a piece of inspired leadership, really. But the the biggest suckers of overhead were us. I had 17 people on my direct staff. I had 7 regional vice presidents. Each one of them had anywhere from probably 6 to 10 branches. We had a ton of overhead and management. And so what we did is we eliminated all of the senior vice president jobs except one. My job got eliminated as part of that. And then we eliminated about half of our regional vice presidents and give them bigger jobs. So we went from 5 senior vice presidents who each had, 5 on average, probably regional vice presidents, to having somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 or 12 regional vice presidents who directly reported to one senior vice president. Why did we do that? Because it saved a boatload of money. And at the end of the day, our conviction, my conviction was, the more we insulate the consumer, the brokerage customer who's walking into the branch from the impact of this, the better off the company will be in the long term. And that's what we did. Well, believe me, we had to have a plan that allowed us to address that. And from a compensation standpoint, what are we going to do? We had a whole series of policies that had already been developed that helped us to make that transition in a very graceful way. I ended up leaving. I had an opportunity to displace a regional vice president, and serendipitously, it led me to a lot of other things, including getting into high frequency trading and algorithmic trading. But it was just, you have to be prepared for those down cycles and know how you're going to address them from a compensation standpoint. Because if it hits you in the face and you're not prepared, then you're running around scrambling and you're making decisions under pressure rather than having those contingencies put in place. A couple other things just to talk about in terms of comp administration really quickly. I already mentioned top performers, and I know this doesn't seem right, and I can talk a little bit about Deming and team-based incentives, but the reality is that it's really hard for humans sometimes to differentiate in terms of people's performance, and we tend not to do it because we value them all as human beings. And so often what happens is there's not a big difference in pay between people who are not contributing, say the bottom 30% of contributors and the top 10% of contributors. And I think that that can be corrosive to an organization sometimes because, let's face it, there's kind of dead weight that's been carried along. People have to work around them. And so one of the things that makes compensation programs effective is when you have effective HR that's comfortable and confident in managing out performance issues. And that's a skill set. It's a hard skill set to learn. It's an unpleasant task that I've had to do many, many times. But I'll tell you, when people feel like performance matters, it matters. When they feel it doesn't, it doesn't. I think there's opportunities for other things to recognize people and to make a difference. Lots of things that you can do in terms of performance recognition, special programs. I love carving out a piece of the merit budget and giving it to the senior executive team to say, here's an extra pot of money that you, in your discretion, can go outside the guidelines of whatever merit matrix increase or whatever and award to people based on your belief that these people are special. And then let's tell them that they're getting a special award. It's not just an extra percent. Here's your merit increase budget. And by the way, this much is coming from a special executives award for you because of the promise, the excitement about your contribution here, and the fact that we want you to know that we absolutely value what you contribute. I'll run through some of these things very quickly. I think in terms of pay administration, the Henry Ford, who created so much innovation, one of the things that he innovated was, a highly structured pay system, which prior to mass production like that hadn't really been typical. And this notion of this is what the pay is and this range and so forth makes a lot of sense. There's a market and you try and, pay the market. You're going to pay some people above and some people below. All that makes a ton of sense. I like having fewer and wider ranges for a variety of different reasons. One is that, you don't spend all your time trying to decide what level a job should be. It's really clear if you have a limited number of ranges. Second, you have tons of room at the top for your top performers, and you have tons of room at the bottom to bring in people who maybe don't have the skills. You know, how do you put a position, a lighting technician in a developer salary range? You know, and so it gives you more flexibility to do those things. Then when promotions happen, they're really big deals, and you can give that 20% pay increase. You can make it a big deal because you've been able to provide a bigger degree of recognition, a bigger increase, and something that will materially change somebody's lifestyle, as opposed to say, well, here's your 5% and your 3% on top of that for your promo. Another thing that I think is really valuable is when you really structure a lot in job descriptions and job content about what it means to advance. And it's not just like, oh, when we're ready for you or whatever. Here's a broad set of skills we expect you to display, you know, sound financial management and judgment, charismatic, effective inspiration and leadership of your team, you know, thoughtful problem resolution, initiative, persistence, and determination. And then describe what those things look like. Have case studies, have stories about people who displayed them, and then talk about those things. That creates a structure where people are like, oh, I know what I have to do, and I want to move forward because this is really cool. I can do those. Oh, I'm going to go over there and learn that stuff. So all of those pieces put together help create more structure. If you're in a variable timing environment, often a merit matrix is timing and percentage increase. If you're in an environment where that's going on, you know, one of the things that I say to people, instead of saying, oh, yes, it could vary from anywhere from 9 to 15 months, you know, make it 3 months to 3 years, because there are some people that, frankly, you're fine with them being paid what they are. Maybe if they leave, you wouldn't, you know, shed too many tears or whatever. It's not that they're bad people. They're fine. You're happy to keep them. There's no reason to keep inflating their pay all the time. And you might have other places where that dollar will really be well spent to keep somebody that's critical to the operation. Exceptions, though. So, whoops. Exceptions. You know, one of the challenges in HR is that you often end up managing to the lowest common denominator. And, you know, that happens because that is consistent with simplicity. This is the rules. That's it. You know, but unfortunately, that's not the reality of the world we live in. And so it's really important to not have knee-jerk responses when there are issues, but actually have a problem-solving pathway that helps you know what to do. Which exception should we make? Which exception should we not make? And often you can anticipate those things. You're going to have a situation where the market pay is higher than existing people in your organization. So do you bring that person in above them, or do you not bring in that person? How do you deal with that? And the answer is it depends on your specific situation. And so that's something, you know, you should explore and talk about, and how do we deal with it? But the reality is you need to have thought about that before you find yourself in that situation. The competing pay offer, you know, oh my gosh, you know, Sarah's leaving. We can't lose her. What are we going to do? You want to have a process and a paradigm for how to react to these things that will require an exception. And if you sit down and make a list of like, what are things that have caused situations before, you can probably develop a little bit of a paradigm and then say, then this will be the process. This is who's involved in the decision-making. These are kind of the parameters. Confidentiality is another thing that, you know, is a challenge. And I think confidentiality in compensation matters is important. And the reason for that is because I talked about how human beings just want to compare themselves to each other. You can't possibly give people all of the context that they would need to understand the rationale behind your judgment. You just can't do it. You would spend your whole time communicating rationale and not doing your job. And so they have to have confidence in your ability to make decisions and their own ignorance as to the specifics. That's a question of trust and confidence. And so the reality is sometimes to do that, you have to share a little bit. You have to tell stories about well, here's the types of situations where we're going to make an exception. So here is what we did in this particular case. And you don't have to go into detail. You don't say we gave her a 17% increase instead of a 10% increase, but you have to say, we evaluate situations relative to the market supply and demand of a position and the urgency of filling that position based on the work that we as an organization have to accomplish. We make exceptions because this person has significant opportunities because of the depth and breadth of their knowledge and their interactions with our customers that make them particularly attractive to our customers. We make exceptions to keep the people we need. Those are types of things. And again, you can even talk about them in advance. This is when we make exceptions. This is when we don't. And set those structures in place so that when those things happen, people aren't like using the gossip mill and going crazy talking about what happened to try and figure out, oh, what happened, Jimmy did. And instead, you can say, hey guys, yeah, there were some things that played out. We understand that there's some knowledge of what's going on. We want to just give you some bare bones in terms of what the situation was and the decisions that we made. Done. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, this is, obviously, this is a major initiative that's undergoing in a lot of corporate America without getting into politics and other things about it. The reality is that if you're administering compensation, you are one of the people who can not only just talk about this, you can really pragmatically influence it. You can look at how your organization treats women versus men. You can look at how they treat people of color versus people who are, European descent. And those are all things that, it's difficult because individuals have different backgrounds, different experiences. But if you're in HR, you probably have some exposure to that type of information about people in terms of, what do they bring to the table? What's on their resume? Where are they? And you can play an active role in terms of just subtly, it doesn't need to be a big fanfare thing or whatever, but subtly changing the culture. And then finally, you have to recognize that not everybody's going to be happy and you're going to piss people off sometimes, and it's just going to happen. And, the thing to do is to treat them with dignity and compassion, say, I'm sorry you're really upset about that. I understand it. We have a difference of opinion on this. I can't give you all the details, but I want you to know that I understand, or better yet, don't put it in the context that you understand what somebody else is thinking. Say, I feel I may have said something that hurt you. Put it in the context of how in some way it influenced you, because they can argue with that. They can't argue with how it makes you feel. And they may still be pissed at you, but at least you have acknowledged that it's of concern to them. And of course, some people are going to do that all the time. And then there's like, is this person corrosive to the organization? We need to have a hard conversation. Bonus plans and incentives. Let me just look at time here. I know we got a late start. About how much time do you think, Kristen, for us to continue?
Yeah, I think maybe like 3 or 4 more minutes.
3 or 4? Okay.
Fly through it.
Yeah.
I want to just make sure we have time for questions.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So a couple things about incentive plans, and I'm sorry we didn't get through all of this stuff. Whoops. Oh, Jeff. So basically incentive plans give you an opportunity to correlate the performance of the business with pay. And so that's something that can be pretty interesting and pretty meaningful for people. There are challenges associated with it though. So while you can create a stronger relationship, you can also introduce risk. And that risk happens if people see it as being arbitrary and capricious, or of being something that they can influence or affect. So basically, incentive plans typically have 2 components. This is generally true of all of them. There's a funding component, which is how much money do we put in the pot? In other words, how much are we going to distribute to people? And typically that's driven by some sort of financial KPIs or other types of things. You want to make sure that there are things that are frequently reported so people know where they stand. It's no good to say, hey, we're going to pay you a bonus at the end of the year based on how the company did financially, and nobody know at any point in time where that is. And particularly in privately held companies, that takes trust. You have to be willing to disseminate some basic information in terms of where are we relative to our incentive objectives. Sometimes that can be very advantageous, because if you need to provide context about where you are, that basic financial information can mean a lot to people sometimes. You just have to be very thoughtful about what you say and how you say it. So funding puts the money in the pot, and then allocation is how you spend that money. And allocation can be formulaic, or it can be discretionary. And often it's a mixture of two of those things. Discretionary systems require a lot of homework, and in particular for intellectual property type work, designers, people, software developers, people like that, it's really hard to attribute individual versus team goals. And so you have to think about, well, is this the appropriate level for us to create an incentive? And maybe a team-based incentive could be more effective in some of those cases. On the other hand, you might have somebody who's a salesperson or a business unit leader, or a person who clearly has some clear business metrics and objectives. And for those people, maybe a discretionary program makes all the sense in the world, because you can say, here was your goal. You were supposed to grow revenue by 7%. We're supposed to improve our margins by X%. There are specific things that they have been charged with in terms of managing the business. What has to happen is a good, solid conversation up front, clean metrics that you can rely on in terms of interpreting how the results were actually achieved. And I would say a pattern of recognition of performance. There's so many companies that pay annual bonuses, and I've experienced this myself, where, at the end of the year, you got a big bonus. At Schwab, I think it was like 40% of our income was in our bonus typically. And, some leaders, they kind of looked at the last 3 months because that's all they could remember. And all those wonderful things you did in the first part of the year, well, you better be concentrating in the last quarter, because that's what they're going to remember when they decide what your bonus is. On the other hand, it can also be an incredibly powerful tool to manage performance on a quarterly basis, to really sit down and have those discussions. And we're not talking about performance evaluation, and that's probably another whole tirade. But I think that, the way you manage performance has to be robust in order for discretionary systems to work. I am going to spend a moment just talking about some things that screw up plans. Poor planning. I put in place an incentive plan once for a software company that was selling operating room software. And we told our salespeople, this is how it will pay. This is how much you got to sell. This is what you have to do. Everybody was really excited about it. Beginning of the year, they went out and hit the ground running, and they completely blew through their objectives by the end of the first quarter. So is that wonderful? No, because we did not have the capacity to install any more software after that point. The objectives, we had just set the wrong measures. We had no idea what we had as in terms of a product. And so what did that mean? We had to say, well, sorry, you can't sell anymore because we can't install it. And then we're like, well, God, I made X amount of money in the first quarter. You mean I'm not getting anything else for the rest of the year? And it was a disaster. And so, you have to be really thoughtful about your goals and objectives. And if there are external factors that can heavily influence whether or not they're achievable. In a general sense, quickly, so that we can answer some questions, I think all compensation systems are imperfect. And, from the standpoint of what you need to achieve, it starts with what is your business about and what are your business's goals. And then it's about like common sense, good judgment, confidence in the programs that you make, humility and acknowledgement when you make, a system of strategies and plans, and then alternatives if those don't work. And then ultimately to be able to be comfortable enough that you'll make the tough decisions that you have to make in order to make this an effective resource. And I can tell you, I've loved my experiences in compensation. It's been a fascinating career. in terms of the comp elements of it and other things that I've had a chance to do. And I think it's one of the most important and powerful levers in all business. And so if you feel comfortable and confident in your compensation, I think you can help your business succeed. And so, wow, with that, everybody's exhausted.
No, thank you, Jeff. We appreciate that. We're going to open up for questions. So if you guys have questions, you can type them in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to take yourself off of mute and ask them. A few minutes left, so now's your chance. Nobody wants to be first. While you guys are thinking of those questions, I wanted to let you know that I did record this, so I'm going to put it up on our YouTube channel, and then I'll send you all the link, as well as Jeff is going to share his slides. So you will get a copy of those as well, to kind of reference back. And then it also has his contact information. So I'm sure he'd be happy to have a conversation offline too.
Yeah, and I just want to say, by all means, please feel comfortable just reaching out to me if you have a little situation or a question or something that you're dealing with. Don't hesitate to give me a call. The consulting, I haven't really started consulting here in Madison. I just fairly recently moved up from Chicago, and I had a side gig in consulting there. I love doing it because I like being engaged with people and helping them fix their problems. But for no cost, I'm happy to help you on any specific challenges or questions that you have. If you have specific situations and you just want to bounce them off somebody, please don't hesitate to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm just in the process of getting my website and other things set up. So you can email me personally at my Gmail or any of the other email addresses that are on this slide. So any questions? I'm sorry, I can't do it. I'm on a call right now, sir. He wants to check my fire alarm.
Tell him he's got to wait 4 minutes.
Anybody?
No, just thankful. I mean, from our perspective, that was a lot to think about. You presented it very well and concisely. I'm grateful for you sharing that time with us, because there was great value in everything you had to say. And I think it's just a lot to process right now, as we want to kind of, maybe review this document from the shared site or this meeting and find out how we can maybe break that down and to see where it may apply and where, we can learn and grow from it. So I'm just grateful for the time.
Thank you. Thank you for joining, and I'm grateful for your time. And I apologize. I tend to get very animated about things sometime and energetic. I do drink a lot of Coke. So
Jeff just really loves compensation.
I do. I love business. I love so many, I love what I do. I have a great team, and I just feel blessed. I'm a very fortunate person in terms of the career that I've had. So I love sharing it with people and helping them.
Yeah, Jason, I think your comments are on point, right? Find 2 or 3 things that you really gravitated towards today. Figure out how to implement them in your business and do it well. And then you can go back and you can do something, at the next level. But to try to probably do it all at once is, gonna cause everybody to throw in the towel. Myself included.
So.
Thank you all.